Hi, everyone. I'm Tish Conlon, and here's another episode of TishTalk podcast. Today, I have Tom Quiggin on with me. What an impressive bio, and I've condensed it. But Tom's a former intelligence officer who served in Bosnia, and after uniform service, he worked for International Crimes Tribunal, RCMP, and many other organizations. He was a court expert on terrorism, wrote a book called National Security Intelligence in an Uncertain Age, was a qualified arms control inspector, has testified on terrorism in numerous occasions, and most recently assisted with the Trucker Freedom Convoy on security issues in Ottawa. Tom actually holds a master's degree in international relations, has been a guest lecturer on security and intelligence matters for numerous conferences. He's written extensively on security and terrorism matters in a number of countries: Germany, Netherlands, UK, USA, Canada, and Singapore, to name a few. Boy, what a bio. Welcome, Tom. Great to have you on today. Did I miss anything? I know you also have a long history in the finance world.
I was also, once upon a time in another life, I was the security and operational risk manager for the Bank of Canada, the central bank, that institution, of course, which is under fire at the moment for inflation and for a certain conservative candidate saying the governor should be fired. That's an issue we can talk about later. My own feeling would, yeah, he should be fired, but that's another story for another day, perhaps.
There's endless topics with your background. I mean, a lot of people are interested in your perspective on the conflict with Russia-Ukraine as a security military sort of terrorism expert, where you see that's going, what's truth, what's propaganda. Obviously, we could talk about our Canadian media as well being corrupted, and what percentage is truth. Talk about our freedom movement with the veterans. I know you and I met at a dinner for Veterans for Freedom with James Todd walking across Canada, and this whole unity with the veterans standing up for our constitutional freedoms and rights. And, obviously, it's fascinating to see this whole COVID narrative collapsing and encouraging. And what outcomes will we see this year, next year, and the following in terms of recession/depression and the collapse within the healthcare sector as well. So which one would you like to tackle first? I mean, there's just many. That's just a handful, probably what you could cover.
Well, there's a whole series of fun topics we could look at. One of them, of course, the sort of big overarching topic that came out of the convoy, it came out of the COVID pandemic, whatever, is this whole business of information, disinformation, propaganda, reality. What's true, what's not true, and
Yes.
How should the average citizen try and wade their way through this? My career actually has a common theme that goes through it, despite my military work, police work, bank work, and a few others. And that's my ability to sort through a pile of information and try and tease out what might actually be real and what might be completely fake, and what's just wrong. I mean, sometimes people are good-hearted, but they still say the wrong thing because they're just wrong. So how does one sort through all that crap? Now, my favorite target on this one, and it's because it's so easy, is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Yes.
They are so heavily involved in such blatant propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. It just makes them an easy target. So just by example, a couple of years ago, I was sorting through a bunch of stories, and I came across this thing in the CBC that said at Maisonneuve College in Montreal, a bunch of disruptive students had been rude and nasty to librarians in the library area. The whole thing kind of spilled over into the parking lot, and then the police were called. And I read this thing and I thought, what's missing from this story? There's something wrong here. First off, why is the national media covering a story about loud students in a college library?
It's a slow day on the news.
And then what are the police doing involved in the parking lot? So it struck me that there's something wrong with the CBC's reporting here, because they sort of linguistically and politically cleanse all their articles. So anyway, I looked the same story up in French. I think it was in the Journal de Montréal or one of those. Turns out what actually happened is there were 10 students who tried to go to fight for ISIS. They were rejected at the Pierre Trudeau Airport in Montreal, caught by the RCMP and told, no, you can't go fight for ISIS, you have to stay here. They were all students at Maisonneuve College. So they moved into the college and they tried to take over parts of the college so that only ISIS-friendly students could use them. They started with the library, they started with a
Wow.
stairwell, weirdly enough, and they started with the prayer space the college had, that only Islamist Muslims could use the prayer space and only they could use the library. Well, it wound up in a confrontation with the librarians. The students then started tracking the staff, tracking their license plate numbers, following them home and threatening them. Finally,
Wow.
somebody called the police, and here we go. So the CBC story, if you read it, would say, oh, minor disruption at a college because students are rude. But if you read the actual story, it says ISIS sympathetic students who wanted to fight for a genocidal
Wow.
terrorist group were in fact attacking college staff. So that's the difference. It's not what CBC reported, it's what they didn't report. And that is
Excellent.
incredibly
Yeah.
damaging. Now, let's move ahead and just look at a couple of other really simple examples. The convoy, the Freedom Convoy 2022. CBC starts out with a story that says, maybe it's the Russians doing it. It must be the Russians doing it. Trudeau has been so hard on Putin. This is Putin's way of getting back at Canada. Now, zero evidence for that. And it's a
Yes.
straw man story. Trudeau's never been hard on the Russians.
All
We
right.
don't
Yeah.
defend the Arctic. We don't do this. We don't do that. We're not pushing oil and gas, which means we're competitors to the Russians. We're not doing that. So, in fact, Putin has no reason to come after Canada because Trudeau serves his interest, if anything. But
Yes.
nonetheless, you know, they take the example from the Democratic Party of the United States that anytime something goes wrong, it must be the Russians doing it. So
Mhm.
they eventually had to kind of back away from the story because it was completely false, no evidence behind it whatsoever. The next thing is, it's the Americans doing it. It's some crazy Americans with all their big money coming up here. And,
Republicans. Yeah.
yeah, so it's got to be them doing it because we can show the money trail. And of course, they show the money trail, and eventually that story turns out to be false. Then, of course, it turns out the convoy's been taken over by neo-Nazis and extremists and Islamophobes and transphobes and everything else. And of course, one person was seen with a Nazi flag at the very start of the convoy, who no one can identify. There's a picture of him with a balaclava on, no idea who it is, but clearly that one flag, which may very well have been a plant, demonstrates that everybody's a Nazi. Now, I thought the fun thing was, a little while later, they had a protest, like a counter protest. They all showed up carrying Soviet flags. So is it fair to say PSAC, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, is a Soviet institution? And it must be because they had Soviet flags there. Now, of course, PSAC is not a Soviet institution. I'm not saying that. But if you apply the same standard to them, you do the convoy, there you are. So that's a problem. Now,
that's a good question. I mean, I think just to slow down, because you said something brilliant there, is every time people read articles, particularly, you know, for those who still read the CBC, I think it's a good thing to ask what's missing at least. And you know, is this true? But what's missing from this story? Why are they even publishing this? What's their angle? Because otherwise, we're going to be led astray every time. I mean, I don't think many people listening to this podcast are still reading or respecting the CBC, but there might be a few. So, yeah.
I still monitor a certain amount of CB stuff just under the intelligent theory that says you should know what your opposition is up to.
Yeah, that's what I do
You should know what the
too.
enemy is doing.
Yes.
Yeah, and interesting enough, the convoy's gone, it's over, it's gone away, whatever. What is the CBC doing? They're running fake stories on the convoy, and they know the information is false. So they ran one a while ago saying, you know, the money is missing, $7.5 million is missing from the convoy. The inference, of course, being that nefarious people are at hand and they stole all the money. Now, of course, if they ever did any research and if they actually looked at it, they would know full well the $7.5 million they're talking about was gift send go money. It's being held in escrow. It's under the control of lawyers, and that's where it is. It's not missing at all. They also wrote this other story about this poor broken man who gave his life savings to the convoy in order to help support them. And then he realized he'd done the wrong thing, and he lost his house, and he lost his income, and he lost everything. And oh, isn't this a sad story? Now, one of the things the CBC didn't bother to do is check to see who this guy really is. I'd love to give his name, but I won't because that's not the point of it. But he's a grifter. He collects welfare in a couple of different provinces. He's been involved in a whole series of scams before. And he scammed people in the convoy out of money. And he's scamming people out of money now. And he just scammed the CBC. Now, here's the issue. He can scam people at the street level because people at the street level tend to be naive. CBC is a big, giant, fat, rich corporation that has tons of staff, more so than most independent media. They have stacks of editors and all kinds of people. And the simple answer to this problem is CBC can afford to do actual fact checking in order to see if the stories are true.
But they
And
don't.
I don't know whether they do or don't. The general theory is you should never assume malice when incompetence will explain the problem.
Yeah,
But with
that's a good one.
CBC, every time they make a mistake or every time there's an omission, it always goes in one direction, not the other. So ultimately, a level of evidence suggests that the CBC has a direct institutional functional bias,
They
which
do.
they do not
Yeah.
admit. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of security, intelligence, and just our homeland security is the divisiveness that's being deliberately employed like a weapon to divide our country. And it's not just CBC; it's all of the sort of so-called liberal medias. You know, Toronto Star. You know, one of them was so despicable about you know, jabbed or unjabbed, and all of these pro and anti, and trying to really put this absolute wedge between families and communities, all for a experimental shot that doesn't even work and isn't safe. But do you think that's being done? There's a sort of a deliberateness to that is just pushing the limits to see how far they can take us and how much division they can create. Do you think that's accurate or deliberate?
Yeah. In political science terms, there's a couple of fancy words for this: the politics of division and the politics of identity. In other words, identity politics is about dividing people into smaller and smaller and smaller subgroups, and then attacking them, labeling them, and canceling or destroying them based on whatever label you can put on them. So the Toronto Star ran an article on me during the convoy, and they said, Tom Quiggin, well-known conspiracy theorist, comma, and away they go. And I mean, they don't mention the fact that I'm a court qualified expert in terrorism, which they're not. They don't
Yes.
recognize the fact that I'm ex-military. I work for the RCMP. I've testified in terrorism. I testified at the Air India trial. I have taught judges and lawyers at the Department of Justice on the reliability of intelligence as evidence. But what
Wow.
they do, and I'm not insulted by it because I know it's their own base level incompetence doing this, is in order to destroy someone, they can't look at the actual facts, because if they
No.
actually dug into my background, you know, whatever. So what they do is they do a straw man thing. They put a label on you first and then explain what you're doing. So, you know, Tom Quiggin, a well-known conspiracy theorist, blah,
Yes.
blah, 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 and away it goes. So that's part of the politics of identity, the politics of division. It's about breaking people down, putting labels on them and destroying them. So you saw that thing of Joe Biden. I don't know if he intended to say it out loud or not, but he did. He said, you know, black people shouldn't be voting Republican. They have to vote Democrat. And you're like, why? Why do people from one particular race, color, linguistic group, or whatever have to vote Democrat? That's the politics of identity. If you're black and if you're a good black person, you vote Democrat. But if you're black and you vote Republican, it's because there's something wrong with you as a black person, and therefore we can disqualify you and we can attack you. So
It's
you put a label on
disgusting.
people and then
Yes.
attack them. Now, the question, of course, why do this? And the answer is simple. It makes it easier to govern people if they are broken up into multiple small fighting factions than if you've got a massive population that works together. So I think one of the reasons the CBC, Toronto Star, and the government of Canada and the government of Ontario, especially Doug Ford, the former hashish dealer, the reason they reacted so poorly to the convoy was that the convoy was able to unite multiple groups of people geographically, i.e.
Yes.
Quebecers and people from Alberta,
It was amazing.
linguistically, French, English, Chinese,
Yeah.
whatever. Ethnically, Sikhs for Truth came out for this one.
Yes,
I was like,
I
what the
met
hell
some
is
of
that?
them.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that one Sikh guy that popped up on the stage and said, "Hey, look at me, I'm a white supremacist." This, and everybody cheers for the guy, and then they
Yeah.
report, "Oh, look, the crowd is cheering for a white supremacist." It's like, dude was a Sikh.
Yeah.
You know, but a whole bunch of Sikhs came out, a whole bunch of Chinese folks come out, South Asians come out. I kind of realized on the first Saturday of the convoy that something really special was happening, because
Yeah.
we were between the canal and the Chateau Laurier, people coming over from Quebec. They're coming up, and there's a whole bunch of guys and women from Alberta carrying Alberta flags, chanting "Liberté, Liberté," being led on by some Quebecois guy with his
Yes.
flag from Quebec.
It,
And it was like, dude,
yes.
what is happening here?
Do you know what? I'm so glad you said that. I can't even count the number of conversations I had with Quebecers who were separatists formerly, who then go, you know what? we just realized it's not the West, it's the government. And the West said the same thing. We've this amazing country. It's not the East, it's the government. So when we stop fighting with each other and we look up, we realize the big problem is the government itself.
I was talking to a reporter in the middle of all this, and they were laughing and saying they'd been in Quebec City the night before. There'd been a thing there where the city of Quebec had blocked the truck out and all this, but nonetheless, they still had a big gathering in the downtown. And he said, I kept looking around. He said, there's a whole bunch of people waving Canadian flags, singing "Oh Canada." And he goes, I'm in Ville de Quebec. He goes, what the heck is happening? He says, a year ago, these people would have been stomped. And
that's
now
beautiful.
Everybody's doing it. Same thing. If you go up through, I was up through the Laurentians a while ago, and this is hardcore Bloc Québécois territory. Talking to a couple of folks up there, says you can't buy a Canadian flag up there anymore because they're all sticking on the back of people's cars. And if you go through the Laurentians, there's Canadian flags on the back of people's cars, and it's like,
that's so heartening. And people need those good news, because a lot of people tell me, I can't wake people up. I can't get them to see that a lot of this is false, is a fake narrative, is a lie. And so they get disheartened. But when you think, it takes a long time for people to dawn on people that they've been duped, or that something's wrong. Once you've decided to go down a certain path, what do you say to people about, maybe how to wake other people up to what's going on, or anything about the whole process of bringing truth to light that would be useful for those that are in the trenches? They feel like they're in the trenches fighting the battle for our freedom and future. What would you suggest?
Well, one of the things that was amusing almost that came out of the convoy was you could go to a convoy event and see what happens. And then you could watch it on the mainstream news, and you'd have to think, was I even on the same planet? But the good news is a whole lot of people have these things now. And one of the comments we got just like from tons of people was they'd say, hey, I was watching the convoy on TV and I thought it was a bunch of white supremacists who were physically attacking the Parliament building. And then, my brother-in-law went and he sent me this video of everybody having this huge party on Wellington Street, and said they realized the discourse between what the mainstream media is producing, what the independent media is producing, what the live streamers are producing, and what you actually see is widely spread. So I think one of the groups that took the hardest damage out of this is the mainstream media. Too many people sort of saw, this, they're white supremacist, Islamophobe, anti-vaxxer, anti-science. People who take up the wrong kind of space, according to Mr. Trudeau, in a very Nazi propaganda kind of language that he was using, which is frightening, actually. And then what people actually saw on the ground, and then I think people started to realize there's something not quite right here. So that's a good thing. Mark Twain said something once, which is a massive piece of truth, and it's very true in the intelligence world and the politics world. It's not hard to fool people. It's hard to convince people that they've been fooled. So look at the pandemic, for instance. We were told lockdowns are absolute necessity. But the reality is Dr. Theresa Tam in 2018 specifically argued against lockdowns. All the emergency measures organizations that were talking about pandemics for the past 10, 15, 20 years, all of them hardcore against lockdowns due to social, economic, and societal damage. But nonetheless, all of a sudden, as soon as the pandemic starts, they fire all the EMO people, won't even talk to them. They just push them out of the room. They put a bunch of doctors in charge, and all of a sudden—
bureaucratic doctors, not even real doctors.
Not even real doctors. And all of a sudden, lockdowns were supposed to be a 2-week thing to flatten the curve. Let's give ourselves a couple of weeks to get straightened out, figure what's going on, and then we move from there. And all of a sudden, it became a tool that lasted, we're still in it. You're still not allowed to fly on an airplane in Canada. You're still not allowed to travel on a train in Canada if you're not double vaccinated. And if I take this correctly, soon to be triple vaccinated, depending on what our beloved government decides to do.
Wow.
And it looks like possibly, if you look at the last budget, Trudeau's folks are in there talking about, funding for blah, blah, blah for the next 3 years as vaccinations are still required for flying and train travel. And you're like, hang on. What is that saying? Are they saying they're planning that for the next 3 years? I'm not saying they are. It's a weird thing to put in a budget if you're not actually thinking about it. And clearly they're thinking about it, or it wouldn't be there. So
As an aside, and I have to ask this because you got, so is what's your thinking about Brian Peckford's lawsuit, challenging our mobility rights for those who didn't sign up for the experimental shot that doesn't even work and isn't safe? I mean, do you think he's going to be successful? I mean, is that coming up in June? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have no specific insight as to whether the suit will be specific or not, and I've testified in enough courtrooms to know that the strongest case in the world can still fall apart, and the weakest case in the world can still win.
Okay,
That's true. Having said that, I think there is a certain amount of momentum building. Mr. Fadden, the guy who's former defense deputy minister, former head of CSIS, former national security advisor. He's Mr. Security in Canada. You can choose to like or dislike the guy, that's fine, doesn't matter. But even he came out and said, look, this whole Trudeau thing with the Emergency Measures Act, and then where he was calling everybody white supremacists and neo-Nazis, whatever, he says, this isn't really good stuff. He says, what you're doing is you're convincing people that the government's not listening to them. So instead of the government addressing the convoy, which they could have done very simply and then just got rid of the convoy, they instead chose to physically attack it, isolate it, and just ran this campaign of slander against it. And even Fadden, Richard Fadden, who is Mr. I mean, he is the Canadian government. He's everything. He came out and just said, yeah, this was a bad idea. Like, you screwed this one. So there are voices starting to speak out. I think the breaking point for a lot of this will be the recession that we have coming.
When do you think that will hit? When do you think that's going to hit? Later this year or early next?
No central bank has ever effectively predicted a recession, partly due to competence, partly due to politics. I won't do it because timing is everything. Bottom line is, it's arguable we're already in a recession. The indicators are already there. It's coming. Now, whether it's official later this year, next year, don't matter. But my argument would be, look, we're moving into recession, which is going to be bad. Canadians are massively in debt. The government of Canada is massively in debt. We've been printing money like it's water for the last 5 to 6 years. There are just so many things wrong. There are so many bubbles. There's bubbles in tech. There's bubbles in real estate. There's bubbles in just every other every other sector of the economy. Plus, we've had a whole bunch of ESG folks, the green folks, saying, oh, we need to get rid of fossil fuels and we need to go with windmills and solar panels, which, of course, as the Europeans are discovering, don't really work, and B, leave you massively vulnerable to outside hits. And
aren't that environmentally friendly when you look at the raw materials, the slave labor, and then the usability, plus what do you do with the parts when you're finished with them, and killing all
it's a problem. But I have this weird optimistic look at the world that says we're going to get a recession, we're going to get a depression, and it's going to be bad. If you think 2008, 2009 was bad, wait till you see this one. It's just going to be a whole lot worse. And this time, our government is already massively broke. We're $1.something trillion in debt in Canada. Trudeau's excess spending before the pandemic and after and during the pandemic has been massive. Now, why am I optimistic? I think that when we hit a point where we get a sovereign debt crisis, when the government can't borrow any more money because nobody will lend it any more money because people will look at it and go, you're just too stupid to lend money to, then we're going to see a problem with government. They're going to be forced into dealing with reality. They're going to be forced to governing reality rather than throwing money at everybody and virtue signaling. And what I mean by governing reality is roads, airports, schools, water, food, that kind of stuff. And government's going to have to get out of the business of trying to decide how many transgendered washrooms you need in an airplane in order to accommodate the 52 different genders that they're identifying. Government is going to have to get back into the actual business of governing rather than trying to socially reconstruct our entire society in their own image and likeness. So my sense is very much either we'll see a return to normal government, which will be fiscally responsible. It'll be in favor of freedom, free speech, democracy, or alternatively, and this is my pessimistic side, says we may see a full-on push for hardcore socialism, and then we'll be in for decades of pain. But I do remain kind of vaguely optimistic.
That's good to hear. Two things. What would you call it? Are we entering into the Greater Depression, or what's going to be the new word for it? You already had the Great Depression, so what have they got left?
I've seen people call it the Greater Depression.
The Greater Depression is.
Yeah, folks I still talk to in the financial world and the central bank world say, look, here's the thing. It's a bubble of bubbles. It's printing, it's debt, it's a whole series of issues. This mess with Ukraine and Russia isn't helping.
No.
But there's a whole series of sins we're going to have to pay for because we've been just grossly overspending since the 80s or the 90s. And the optimistic view is we're going to get a recession. The negative side effects will be felt for about 5 years, and then we'll gradually start to work back out of it.
That's good to hear.
The more pessimistic impression is this is a 7 to 10 year thing before we get back to where we were in, say, 2019, 2020.
Some people, could you comment on the validity of the claim that with a sort of a bankrupt scenario that would give the UN more power to come in and take control and sort of more of a totalitarian type of government leadership, which terrifies a lot of people in some of these freedom communities. And there's been, you know, little bits and articles and videos on that. Is that something that could actually happen? You know, sign canned over to the UN. We have UN government, you know, with this WHO treaty as well as pandemic treaty they're talking about. A lot of people are terrified of that. They're going to be able to say, you need to take this pill, this treatment, you know, just because. Is that a real possibility, or is that more scare tactics like fake media?
Yeah, there's a couple of different things going on here. If you actually drill down through all the nonsense and the foolishness and the conspiracy theories and whatever, there are actual real problems. And one way of looking at this is a system called elite capture. In other words, I mean, people run around saying, you know, it's the Order of Knights Templar are behind the banks and they control the Rothschilds, who control the Jews in London, who control whatever. And it's all just a bunch of nonsense, that part. However, if you want to actually drill into it and look at what's really going on, we do have a system of elite capture. So the World Economic Forum, with its annual Davos meeting, which, by the way, is the world's largest collection of private jets. More private jets land on one airfield at any time than anywhere else in the world than Davos. So the people who are telling us we have to ride bicycles and eat bugs are the same people that drink red wine and fly around in private jets.
Yeah, so, and didn't lock down at all.
So here in Canada, someone who's not double vaxxed can't fly in an airplane. But if you can afford to rent a private jet, you can go that way. That's the point. So that's elite capture. Now, when I say elite capture, what do I actually mean by that? Well, you have a certain aristocratic elite, you have a certain technocratic and bureaucratic elite who are very happy with the way things are right now. They fly around in private jets, they have big yachts, they eat nice steaks, they have per diems. And why would they not want to keep that? And in fact, why wouldn't they want to reinforce that? So when you look at the Klaus Schwabs of the world, what they actually believe is the elites, as he would describe them, the technocrats, the bureaucrats, should really be controlling the whole world because they're more intelligent than you are. And by the way, they understand what's good for you, where you don't really understand what's good for you. Only they really understand it. So their belief is that the super elites should move into the top positions and they should start controlling everything. So, for instance, one example of this, and this addresses your concern directly, is Canada is now involved with this project with the World Economic Forum. It's the government of Canada, it's Air Canada, it's Pierre Trudeau Airport, it's Toronto Pearson Airport, and it's the World Economic Forum, and it's this safe traveler thing. And it's all about safety in traveling, and it's all about ease of transport. Well, what they mean by that, of course, is they're going to track all your personal data. They're going to track all your movements. And if they assign negative points to you, oh, we think you tested positive for this disease, or, oh, you spoke at a conference where you shouldn't have, ding, your safe travel thing goes out the world. In other words, the government of Canada is, and you know, I'm not making this up, go to the World Economic Forum website and read it. They're talking about safe travel for everybody, where the World Economic Forum and their bureaucracy will get to decide who can safely travel and who can't. In other words, they want to control travel. So for people who are afraid and make up the conspiracy theories, that's the actual reality. It's elite capture. That's what's happening.
Well, that's fascinating. And I've learned over the years that these euphemistic, happy-go-lucky slogans, like, you know, from travel, not only from traveling extensively in the former East Bloc countries, where they said freedom for all and everyone was starving and destitute, safe travel is really kind of intending the opposite. A lot like Bill 100, which is keeping Ontario open. And what they want to do is, if you even protest, they have the right to, you know, to seize your property and car and shut you down, imprison imprison you. I mean, this environmental social governance should terrify every Canadian. That's a
It's Orwellian,
communist
yeah.
style. It's communist style governance. And I would take things a bit further, and maybe this isn't that conspiratorial land, but I think the elites and those who, these elite capture, they want to go a bit further. The most profitable business in the world is slavery, and they'd rather us own nothing and be happy for our good, which is really their good, because the more they can extract from us, the more it goes to them. So it's just an endless greed that will stop at nothing, including our life, our liberty, our homes, our property. And it's definitely not for our good. So I think they're aiming for something far worse than socialism.
Actually,
as a goal.
It's fascinating from a political science point of view. People go, well, they're a bunch of communists. And I go, well, they're not really. And other people, well, they're fascist, And I go, well, they're not really fascists either. It's a new ism. It's kind of an elitism. And what it basically is, it's kind of a blend of, you take some of the most corrosive aspects of Marxism or communism, depending on your choice of terminology. You combine that with some of the worst aspects of fascism, again, depending how you define it, and you wind up with this current sort of thing. So communism is what? Communism is a totalitarian state where there's no input from the citizens, and the state controls the means of production as well as everything else. So what is fascism? Well, fascism is a totalitarian state where the citizens have absolutely no input, but the elites control the means of production. In other words, the big factories, the big processes, whatever. But even the elites have to bow to the will of the government. So the spread between fascism and communism is actually rather narrow at the end of the day. It's all about who owns the large corporations, et cetera, and who controls them. So what we actually see happening now is a blending of this, where the elites are setting these things up and saying, oh no, you can be a capitalist, you can run your own company, you can run your own firm. But, and here's the thing, we're going to be able to tell you who should sit on your board. We're going to determine the makeup of your board. We're going to tell you, for the good of your company, what products you're allowed to sell, when you're allowed to sell them, at what price you're allowed to sell them. So they tell you, oh yes, we encourage we're not against capitalism. In fact, we encourage it. It's controlled capitalism. In other words, an elitist group who make up the governing bodies plus the bureaucracy will then tell you what you can do. So here in Ontario, Waleed Suleiman and what's his face there, Doug Ford, our former hashish dealer, got together and they decided to re-examine capital markets in Ontario and who should be able to invest, who should control what, who's on the boards, what power should the board have, what should the Toronto Stock Exchange do? And some of it was quite sensible and some of it probably needed updating. But one of the things that got thrown in there is the idea that you can start a company, you can publicly list it on the stock exchange, but after X numbers of years, the government will be able to tell you who's on the makeup of your board. You must be these many people and those people on your board. In other words, that's the thin end of the wedge. And it's right here in Ontario, where this controlled capitalism or centralization or state socialism, whatever you want to call it.
Public-private partnership is another term that's used to implement the same thing.
Yeah, so that's a weird one because the public-private partnership used to be considered a good thing. In other words, the public, i.e. the government, had an interest in getting something done, but private groups sometimes do it better. So the Ottawa airport, the one we're using now, is a triple P project, and it actually worked well. It came in on budget, it's clean, it works, it's not bad. But what the term has now been twisted, and it's been sort of captured, if you will, to the idea now that the public-private partnership is the public will control this and the private part will be forced to follow along.
Yes, that's what I've seen too. Yeah.
So the Great Reset is actually a term that comes from well before the World Economic Forum captured the term. And back in 2010, 2012, 2013, people were saying there was going to be a Great Reset, there was going to be a Great Reckoning. And they said there may be, in fact, a great resetting of all debt. There may be a debt jubilee. In other words, the financial system is such a mess that at one point the whole thing will collapse in on itself and we'll have to start over again.
Do you think that will happen? Will there be?
I think we're potentially looking at that now. We have kicked the can so far down the road for so long on everything financial that sooner or later it's going to collapse in on itself, and we may be seeing the start of that right now. So that, which is a whole other discussion for another day.
Yeah, can you quickly comment? I know we could speak an hour on just the digital currency and central currencies and things, decentralized cryptos as well. Can you comment on that in terms of just a short, how that will factor in the Great Reset, and will it be good or bad for people ultimately?
Well, there's two things going on. There's cryptocurrency, which is like an electronic based currency if you want to really melt it down to something simple. But there's two sides to it. One is, let's say, the Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ripple, whoever, and those are private, non-governmental groups who are attempting to create a useful currency which will be outside of the means of control of the government. And they say this will give you a certain amount of financial freedom and it'll work against inflation. Whether that's true or not, I won't get into the argument, but that's their argument, and it's not a bad one. Now you've got government looking at Bitcoin and Ripple and Ethereum, and they're going, wow, we don't like these guys. We want to control the economy. We want to be able to tell what people to do. So we're now getting what will be called central bank controlled cryptocurrencies. Central bank cryptocurrency. In other words, your Canadian dollar, which you now have, or your American dollar, or your British pound or whatever, will be replaced by a crypto dollar. So you'll have your phone, which you'll be forced to have, or your electronic device will have all your money on it. And you'll, beep, beep, you'll buy your gas, and beep, beep, you buy a bag of chips or whatever. But the government, the central bank, controls all of that, and they track all of it. So every penny you spend, every dollar you spend is tracked. So if I want to buy a used lawnmower from you, you have to declare the sale. Because you sold it to me, and I have to declare purchasing it. So the government go, oh, that was a sale. You need to pay sales tax on that.
Yes.
And if the government is upset with you, they can turn off all your currency, and they can track your currency from the date of inception till the end of time.
So or you can't buy fruit this week because you were behaving badly on social media.
So if Canadians were rather startled when people had their credit cards shut off and people had their payment system shut off, by the banks, but by the government, then wait till you see the idea they'll be able to turn off everything. They will be able to cripple you totally. So again, the conspiracy theorists out there are saying, this is this is that. Well, actually, it's a technology developing. They're looking at it and they're saying, how can we effectively use this to control society? And that's one way. The other way that parallels this, and people don't get this, and they should be getting it. So let's say, for instance, right now, I think starting next year, the European Union is insisting that all cars have this electronic system on it. GPS enabled, it'll track everywhere you go, how fast you go, whatever. It also allows them to turn the car off.
Oh, no.
So in California, same thing is happening. All electric vehicles, people are buying EVs. Oh, I have an electric vehicle. I'm pure and I save money. And of course, now they're going to be charged a road tax for traveling. And they say, well, how are you going to know whether you traveled or not? Well, the GPS you'll be forced to have in your car will tell them which road you traveled on, when, and how far you went, how fast you went. You'll be taxed on that. Now, the flip side of that, again, once is they can turn your car into a brick at the flick of a switch. So your shiny new Tesla that you paid, I don't know, $120,000 for the nice one, all of a sudden becomes a large hunk of plastic. Because they can turn it off and there's nothing you can do about it. It just sits there. They can turn your phone off and they can turn all your currency off if they get a central bank controlled cryptocurrency.
Let's hope they don't. Let's hope they don't.
Yeah. So when you hear people sort of, they make up conspiracy theories that someone's trying this and someone trying that, it's like, well, take a step back and look at it. Actually, it goes back to elite capture. It goes back to the elites determining how can we control society. And what's happening is there's this bizarre alliance between big tech and big government. Again, elite capture. Mark Zuckerberg isn't exactly an average guy.
No.
He is like, I don't know where he is, third, fourth, fifth richest man in the world, whatever it is, doesn't matter. So what you're seeing is this transnational globalist kind of elites looking at each other, recognizing each other's interests and saying, we need to keep moving the system up under a time of stress. So just while we're on the subject of that, there's something going on, which is kind of weird. Used to have a steel factory, took 5,000 people to run it. It needed a coal mine to fuel it. Well, that was another 1,500 people. You need a railroad. Well, that's a couple of hundred folks. All of a sudden, we ship all our jobs to China, 5,000 guys at the factory. We don't need them anymore. Why not? Because the factory's in China. So people say, Bill Gates is trying to kill everyone. And it's like, well, no, probably not. But the Bill Gates of the world and many other people are correctly identifying that in a post-industrial society, you don't need 5,000 people in a steel factory. What you need is 100 guys down at the yard. So you've got 4,900 excess, as many people call them, useless eaters. In other words, The elites are starting to recognize that a industrial society required industrial sized workforces. A post-industrial society doesn't. So
Can you comment on, you brought up relocating factories to third world or other countries with lower costs, labor costs, et cetera. But can you comment on the transition into robotics and AI? Because that's another human replacement, that some of these factories are just outfitted completely with robots. They don't need any humans, whether they live in North America or China. Can you comment on that?
One thing that's kind of funny right now, the joke is actually in China right now. They're actually facing labor disputes, labor problems and all this stuff because their workers are figuring out that they should actually get paid. What a stunning thought. And now China's outsourcing stuff to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia. But forget all that for a minute. Your actual question is, look, we hear Justin Trudeau, migration and immigrants are going to rebuild the economy. That's how we're going to restart the economy. So you look at who they're bringing in, and they're basically low skills people who are being brought in for family reunification, women at risk, refugees, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, what's happening here? On the one hand, we're told, oh, we need more people in the workforce. Yet at the exact same time, the government's telling us artificial intelligence is the way to go. Self-driving trucks are just, a year down the road kind of a thing. Self-driving taxis are going to be with us in another, well, they're already here in some areas. So we see this massive disconnect between the government's propaganda and the actual reality. And this is why a number of people are saying maybe what we need to do is cut immigration to zero for about a year and then take a deep step back and say, what do we actually need for a workforce in Canada? Do we need
absolutely?
Do we need guys that shovel coal still? Well, maybe we do. Do we need people that can cut wood? Maybe we do. Should we be onshoring our factories, and should we be onshoring our energy production capability?
I've run a recruitment firm for over 20 years, and I couldn't agree with you more in some of those areas. I mean, we need skilled labor, but when you look at more and more people, I casually had lunch with a friend who was just complaining about the growing homeless population in the subways. If we can't look after our own citizens, I mean, that's just a massive, we have tragedy. We're not looking after citizens. We've bankrupted a lot of the small businesses who are destitute now, who are trying to make a living. We didn't look after our vets very well. I mean, I think we need to look after our own citizens and help with skills training to allow people to get into positions first as a Canadian, and then make the process of getting new immigrants in one dependent on what we need for skilled labor. That's the perfect scenario forward.
Yeah, funny story from Bank of Canada days. As the security and operational risk manager there, one of our jobs when we're working with other G10 central banks was the business of social unrest. What is the connection between civil unrest, social unrest, rioting in the streets, and the economy? And of course, there's some pretty obvious and direct links between them. Folks get hungry, they tend to get mad, they tend to throw rocks and bottles, fairly obvious at a certain level. But at one point, I went up to see the economists, the folks we jokingly call the squints or the quants, those kinds of people with PhDs in math that, I've never heard of. And I asked a question and said, I'm trying to figure out how many Canadians are the proverbial 2 paychecks away from losing the roof. And this guy with a PhD in, I don't know, it was like infinitesimal calculus or something like this, and economics just over my head. He gives me that very polite smile that those kinds of people do when they're talking to the peasantry. And he says, we don't actually use that as a metric. He says, but what I think you're asking is this. And then he went on to explain to me about household incomes, debts, percentages, interest rates, whatever. And if at the end of the month, you're not meeting this figure, then we can identify you as being in trouble. In other words, I said, so in other words, if this guy here loses his job, he's 2 paychecks away from losing the roof. And they laughed and said, yeah, that's it.
Jeez,
so bottom line is they track this stuff.
Not funny. It's not funny, but
it's not funny. It's very serious. So a little thing just came out about 2 weeks ago, and it says, look, I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like half of Canadians are $200 a month away from insolvency.
It's so
insolvency,
horrible. Yeah.
So just to be clear, insolvency in this case is almost the same thing. Here's your income from the month. Here's your bills from the month. Hopefully the two of them meet, or hopefully you have some money left over. So what they're saying is about half of Canadians can't absorb a $200 a month increase without going further into debt. And of course, what we're seeing is more credit card, more HELOC, more borrowing from the bank of mom and dad. So as we move into a recession with happens to have very high inflation, those people who right now are living on the line, which is, according to these guys, 50% of Canadian households are living on the line,
50%.
are going to move to
That's
the
sad.
other side of the line. So that is a key predictor of people are going to be angry. People are looking for solutions. The question, of course, is when does it turn violent? And that's very connected to demographics and food. In other words, when the price of food spikes suddenly, or the availability of food drops suddenly, that's when people go into the street and actually start throwing things.
What do you see there, just to interject, because a lot of people as well who I've spoken with are concerned about food security. I mean, you're a security expert. You see in the US, there's all these meat processing plants just suddenly burning down. Few in Canada, there's restrictions put on agriculture and livestock. I saw a few little notices in Alberta even. And, you know, now there's the avian flu. You know, obviously I recommend everyone to have what should we call it? We're not going to call it a victory garden, but a recession garden, let's call it, or an insanity garden with what's going on. But what do you see in terms of the security for Canada?
Yeah, couple of things going on here that's worth looking at. Before we had the war in Ukraine, before we had the worst part of the pandemic, what's it called? The WA, the World Agricultural Organization, actually they look around the world, they divide food into 7 baskets: cooking oil, vegetables, meat, dairy, grains, cereals, that kind of stuff. And they said, look, due to a whole series of circumstances, we expect the cost of food year over year to go up 20%. So the last year leading up to this year, averaged out across the planet, averaged out across those 7 baskets of food, price went up 20%. And they're saying right now it's running 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10% a month, depending which basket you look at. And they expect to see food go up another 20% this year. That didn't take into account the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, which is going to cut out about 25% of the world's exported cereals and grains, which means prices are going up again. So here in Canada, I don't think we're going to see food shortages in the sense you go to the grocery store and there'll be nothing there. That's not a problem in Canada. What you're going to see is people go in with their grocery carts and come out with virtually nothing because they don't have any money. And when this fall strikes, when you turn your furnace back on, and I don't know about anybody else, but I watched natural gas prices for heating a house almost doubled in the last couple of years.
Yes.
You know, and it's doubled from, like, you know, averaged out to $1,200 a year to averaged out to $2,400 a year. Again, for those people who live on the proverbial line, or people who have, you know, mom, dad, kid, and a dog or something, we are looking at people who next fall are going to start making hard choices about, do they turn the furnace down to like 12 degrees in the house, or do they buy groceries this week?
Isn't
and
that
I think
tragic?
that is the kind of thing the Europeans are looking at right now. That is the kind of thing we should be start thinking about now. So, I mean, we discussed this issue once before of what should one do at a time like this? And the answer is cash is king, debt is bad. Do not take on more debt if you don't have to. Pay off debt if you can. Do not buy another X drive. Do not buy an Xbox. Do not buy an 82-inch flat screen right now. It's just a really bad idea. In other words, cut back, lessen your footprint. You should have a smaller house, a smaller car, a smaller budget, so that you can survive smaller. Now, the other thing is, my grandmother, and I would assume yours, I don't know, used to keep a pantry. And a lot of houses used to have a pantry, and that's where you kept the food. And as my mother would say, oh, that's on sale, we better get it fast before the hoarders get it. And I mean, it's a joke, but the point is well taken. Right now, if you're looking down the road and you're making twice as much money as you made last year and you got a bonus, well, you know, good on you. If you're making the same money you were 2 years ago and you're not sure about the future of your job, you should be paying attention. So toilet paper, paper towel, pasta, rice, soap you use to wash the dishes, soap you use to wash your hands, soap you throw in the dishwasher and the laundry machine and all that kind of junk. Anything that has a shelf life, you should know what the proper price of that is. What is a good price to pay for something? Watch for it to come on sale, and instead of buying one, buy 2.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. Or 5 if you can.
So to explain it in financial terms, your dollar right now is worth something. So I can go out and buy a little loaf of bread at Walmart for $1 right now, the little baguette kind of thing for $1.
Yes.
Not too long ago, that was 50 cents. So right now, $1 gets you one loaf of bread. A year from now, your $1 will probably get you half of that. So your dollar still looks like a dollar. You're still making $60,000 a year, or at least you think you are. Your purchasing power, however, is shrinking rapidly due to inflation. And
Yes.
inflation in Canada is officially running at 5 or 6%, whatever it is. In the real world where I live and where you live and a lot of other folks live, it's actually more in closer to 20%. Fuel is up, heating your house is up, electricity is up,
Absolutely. Well, I
fees.
wanted to, I mean, you have so just brilliant tips and common sense, and even, stretching and look at from a financial savings perspective, even buying that extra bit of food, but learning proper food storage. I just wanted to add that in for the audience, because, if you can get Mylar bags, freeze-dried food, sometimes that can last, 15, 20 years plus. Proper storage is going to extend the shelf life of a lot of these foods. So, if it's really on sale and you can afford to buy 3 and you have proper storage, some of these can be extended for multiple years. That's really going to help get us through this depression that's coming at us.
Yeah. Another thing my father started me on years ago, and I still do it. I'll watch people in grocery stores to see what they're doing. And I see people walk up, look at the hamburger thing, grab it, throw it in the cart, and away they go. I walk up, I look at the hamburger thing, and I look at the cost per kilo. I don't look at how much is in it and the total package. And if it's 12 bucks, 16 or 18 bucks a kilo, I ain't buying it. Sorry, just not going to happen.
Oh, yes.
So what you should do is when you go into a grocery store, know what you want, have a plan, and only buy what's actually on price or proper. So if beef that week is super expensive, or chicken right now, you used to pay $8.80 a kilo for chicken. Now it's like $12, $15, $17. I don't buy chicken anymore at 18, 20 bucks a kilo. Not doing it. So I wait till it's $8.80, then I buy a few of the packages. So know what the price should be and buy what you actually want at the price you can afford.
Yes.
If you don't, you're going to wind up paying 200 to 300% more for food. So here's a funny one, just as a price comparator. A box of Kraft Dinner is a box of Kraft Dinner no matter where you buy it. Shoppers Drug Mart, you can buy it at Loblaws, you can buy it in New York, you can buy it in London, you can buy it here. It's the same crap in every box. So it's a good comparator. Just before the pandemic started, you could still get a box of 12 Kraft Dinner for $6. In other words, 50 cents a box. So that's your baseline price that you should be paying. So if it's any more than 50 cents a box, you should be thinking about it. Right now, it's drifted up to around $1 a box if you buy it in bulk in 12. But I see it regularly being sold in stores for $2.49, $3.29, and it's like, if you're paying $3.29 a box for that, you paid 6 times what I paid for the box I got, and you're paying 3 times what you should.
Not that I advocate for all this processed food, because my advice to people, because health is wealth, and we spend so much time on all our medications and all these other things, going shopping, like Michael Pollan said, a great author on the food system and all the corruption and all the toxins. Walk around the perimeter, just buy the 1 or 2 ingredient foods. That's going to keep you a lot healthier, and it's much more filling and satisfying. Get relationships with farmers. I only buy from my butcher higher quality meat. You can go direct to farmers, hopefully sometimes, and get some deals, or buy in bulk with a co-op, with a group of people, so you can get to quantity for less prices. I mean, all these things are going to help. Absolutely.
Yeah, and buying raw food is cheaper than buying processed food, because you're not paying for somebody else's labor.
Buy flour, make your own bread, get a bread maker. So on a final topic, I mean, I probably could talk to you for hours more, is your insights into the Ukraine-Russia conflict and how we can avoid that escalating. History has taught us that the only people that benefit from war are those who are manufacturing arms, and maybe the bankers and a few other, special industries, the people themselves. It's such a tragedy. We want to avoid getting drawn into this. What's happening there, and what's your prognosis, positive, negative?
Yeah, just when you step back and look at things, it's fascinating how we went from pandemic, vaccine to must support Ukraine. The most important thing in the world right now is to support Ukraine. And it's not whether you should or you shouldn't, and that's another thing. But it's fascinating to watch the pivot from vaccine narrative to Ukraine narrative. And of course, the next one will be the climate lockdown narrative, but whatever. But here's kind of the thing with Ukraine. It borders with Russia. There's a whole bunch of bad history there. It's been going on for centuries. Parts of that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, like Crimea used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. It used to be part of Genghis Khan, and his guys used to run parts of that. King Charles XII of Sweden ran it for a while. Napoleon Bonaparte invades Russia. The Nazis invade Ukraine. I mean, it's an area that's been in conflict for forever. And the history of Central Europe is the history of European war. There's no two ways taking it apart. So the current scrap in Ukraine, to sort of look at it just recently, starts when the American government basically sponsors the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in order to put in a more, American-friendly government, which really upset Russia and really drew a lot of attention around the world. Russia responds to that eventually by pouring more influence into the Donbass area. And they said, you know what, Crimea, which is traditional Russian territory, I know you're not supposed to say that, but Crimea was Russian-held territory throughout the entire Soviet period and before that. And it was only when one of the Soviet leaders got drunk one day and decided to award it to Ukraine for some weird Soviet political reason that it became Ukrainian territory. Nonetheless, Putin goes in, seizes control of it, and then he starts putting huge amounts of influence into the Donbass region. So this is 2014, in other words, 8 years ago. What did the Europeans do? What did the Americans do? Well, they yelled and screamed and said he was a commie and a bad guy and a bunch of stuff. And they said, whoa, sanctions and bad things. But of course, the end result is they did nothing. Chancellor Schroeder of Germany, Chancellor Merkel of Germany, continued to invest in Russia, continued to buy Russian gas. They paid for the expansion of the Russian military. And all of a sudden, this sort of nasty bit of business that's been going on for a few hundred years turns hot. Putin invades. So now from a nasty backwater war where we kill a few thousand people a year, all of a sudden we've got a hot war where we're killing, tens of thousands of people in fairly quick time. So it kind of goes from civil war to war between two countries to what now, where we see the NATO countries led by America are pouring tons of weapons, tons of money in there. And it's openly become a proxy war between America and Russia using Ukraine as the fighting territory. And the problem here is not so much whether we should or shouldn't, and people use the Hitler analogy saying, if we don't stop Putin now, he's Hitler and he'll take over the world, which of course is silly. He can't even take over Ukraine, as it turns out. He's doing a crappy job there. But we're telling the Ukrainians, well, we're going to support you. We're going to keep giving you weapons. In other words, we'll keep getting your country destroyed. We'll destroy your people. We'll get you people killed while we obtain our political objective of weakening Russia. So, I mean, it's a really nasty trick to pull on the Ukrainians. But the real threat here is if this thing grows beyond the borders of Ukraine, then it has a tendency to spread very quickly. There's a fancy political term called mutability. And basically what it means is things mutate. In other words, a war starts out as a nasty little scrap on a back street somewhere. And the next thing you know, you've got World War II on your hands. World War I mean, is a great case where it starts in Sarajevo with some guy, Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian Black Hand terrorist, shoots some second-rate Archduke from Austria that nobody ever heard of and nobody cared about. But all of a sudden, it's a big deal. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire gets nasty with the Serbs get nasty with the Turks get nasty with the Russians get nasty with the French, the Brits get nasty with the Germans. And the next thing you know, we killed 20 million people. Now, it's not Gavrilo Princip's fault. He didn't start the war, but he lit the spark that lit the fire that spread. And unfortunately, the analogy is probably reasonable right now to say that we could be at that point. If we keep pouring into Ukraine, we may be sort of facilitating a much larger war. And you have to look at with a bit of suspicion and say, do we actually care about Ukraine? Because they say, the entire world is seized with this. And that's a basic lie right there. The entire world is not seized with this war. When the United Nations voted, about 134 countries, the United Nations either abstained or voted against anything against Russia. Because
I was just going to have to give, but I go on. I mean, you're so knowledgeable, but people are asking me constantly, the corruption in Ukraine. And when you listen to some of the Republican stations as well, they're talking about there's bioweapon labs there. There's all of the Biden crime family, money laundering in Ukraine, which is why they really are trying to avoid having Russia find this stuff. Is there truth in that?
One way of looking at this, I always go back and look at the least likely sources that would be commenting on something like this. So the Guardian newspaper is a tree-hugging, lefty kind of outfit, which over the recent years has become a full-on progressive outfit. If you go back and look at their coverage of Ukraine prior to the invasion, it's absolutely scathing.
Yes.
And, you know, these are the progressive lefties who right now tell us we have to respect borders and save Ukraine. But just before the war, it's the most corrupt country in Europe, which it was. They had the Azov battalion, which was openly flying the Black SS, the Black Circle, and all that sort of stuff. In other words, hardcore Nazis. And these are like Nazis, not some idiot who thinks he's a white supremacist. This is actual organizational structure kind of Nazis. And of course, Ukraine has a, how to put this nicely, they have a bit of a dodgy relationship with Nazism over the years. For instance, our own beloved Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, her grandfather was a Ukrainian full-on Nazi. Not
Freeland.
a cooperator, Freeland,
Yes.
yeah. Her grandfather was a pro-Nazi agitator before Germany invaded. He ran a publishing paper sort of thing. So the history of Nazism in Ukraine is like highly sensitive to a lot of people.
What about the genocide? That's another quick comment. I've heard there was up to 14,000 people, Russian descent, that were brutally murdered over the last 8 years by the puppet regime.
Yeah, well,
is that true, or is there any validity to that?
The 14,000 figure is probably accurate. The question of who's killing who, everybody kind of looks at the war in Ukraine as though it just suddenly started right now. And oh my God, you know, the death and destruction. It's like, well, where were you guys since 2014? There has been a low-level civil conflict in Ukraine since 2014, where Group A, which is Ukrainians, had been involved in shooting a whole bunch of people in Group B, Russian Ukrainians. And the Russian Ukrainians, for their part, had been busy shooting the Ukrainian Ukrainians. So there's been low-level civil war at the village level for the last, well, since 2014. And the numbers aren't quite clear, but one of them that gets kicked around is 14,000. So people now, you know, say they're suddenly shocked at the killing. It's like, where the hell were you for the last 14 years? Where were you, or the last 7 years?
It wasn't reported in the mainstream media, and if you don't look outside of that, you only get their story.
It didn't suit the narrative of the time, so it was ignored. And of course, it doesn't suit the narrative at all right now. Other little interesting thing, I was actually in Eastern Ukraine in a place called Konotop way back in 1993 or 1994, something like that.
Oh, interesting.
And it was a conventional forces in Europe, arms control treaty, intrusive on-site inspection, where we were allowed to show up unannounced in Kiev.
Wow.
And then identify the base we want to go to. Of course, we wanted to go to the eastern part out by the Russian side to see what's going on. And there was one embarrassing moment where the whole thing went terribly wrong. We arrive in Konotop, we meet the base commander. The official inspection language was supposed to be Ukrainian, which was a bit of a problem, but nobody on the base spoke Ukrainian. They were all Russians.
Oh, really?
The reality is a good chunk of Eastern Ukraine is actually Russian speaking.
Wow, that's messy already.
When you look at the areas right now in Ukraine where the conflict is and where the fighting is, and then if you overlay that with an ethnic map of Russia, of course, it's Russia attempting to reassert control over areas which have high Russian speaking content. They're ethnically Russian speakers, they're Orthodox. So none of this justifies what Putin did, by the way. It was a stupid move on his part. It's a disaster for everybody concerned. But to paint it in pure black and white terms, of course, is rather difficult. Same thing with the former Yugoslavia. We were always told Group A is bad and Group B is good. Yes. When we got to the former Yugoslavia on the ground, you kind of look around, and General Mackenzie, of course, made that wonderful comment when he was asked, well, who are the good guys? And he goes, well, I go to a meeting, he says, with 3 different factions. He goes, that guy killed 10 people, that guy killed 20 people, and that guy killed 50 people. Which one's the good guy?
Exactly. It gets so complicated. I think the best thing to do is to avoid further involvement in Canada. I mean, there's no benefit to escalating a war when there's so many factors involved, and there's no clear good guy. There's bad guys on all sides. Why are we getting involved? Why aren't we looking after our own citizens here? We have such massive problems here in Canada. That's where we need to address.
So a question kind of comes up, is there anything useful that can be done from the outside, or are we helpless? So I just sat in earlier this week on a 2-hour European security conference in Amsterdam, which I went to via Zoom because, you know, whatever. So that's fine. But it was interesting. One of the points they raised, they said, within the first couple of weeks of this invasion, there was an opportunity for settlement. There were peace talks going on. There was position A, there was position B. We accept this, we can't accept that. And all of a sudden that went away completely. So they said at the start of the conflict, Zelensky actually more or less kind of agreed to the idea that NATO's off the table. There's going to be no NATO in Ukraine, which there isn't going to be anyway. He also was agreeing to some sort of discussions about what to do with the Donbass, which is eastern Ukraine. Should it be Russian sovereign territory?
Yes.
Should it be a Ukrainian independent state? Should it be, a protectorate or something like that? There was room for discussion, and there was thinking it could actually move in that direction, and the war could actually be brought to a halt. So the question is, why wasn't it? Well, all of a sudden we got overtaken by this mutability. We decided we want to go in and we want to have, everybody join the war, pour weapons in. And now we have no discussion whatsoever. So if Canada was to have an actual useful role, along with the sort of traditional non-aligned and neutral, or, the sort of, the Norways, the Swedens, the Indias, the Canadas, the Japans, and all that sort of stuff, there is a potentially useful role we could play in there by advocating for, let's go back to where you were in the first couple of weeks of the war and see what can be sorted out here. However, at the moment, the idea of any kind of discussion, as soon as you bring that up, well, that's a pro-Russian feeling. And it's like, well, it's a let's not destroy Ukraine and start World War III kind of discussion.
Yeah,
but nonetheless, there it is. So opportunities are there, and hopefully some saner voices will float to the surface. But here we are.
I hope so. I read that Canadians were actually implicated in training, the Azov Battalion, and had numerous people over there, and now they're hiring people. Freelance fighters, some of them coming from Canada. I hope that we can stop that. Listen, Tom, we could go on for hours. Is there anything you wanted to tell, Canadians who are tuning in that might give a little hope for what's to come, or how we can navigate through this crisis, chaos, uncertainty, and maybe keep our sense of humor and come out the other side, maybe stronger, a little wiser, and hopefully one day more prosperous?
Yeah, there's a lot of good things going on. You just don't see them reported in the news, or if the news reports them and calls them, white supremacy or something. But the convoy did something, and that was it brought all the issues up onto the table. Stuff you weren't allowed to talk about, all of a sudden now people are talking about it. So the convoy was huge in the sense, and it also identified, it wasn't a bunch of crazy truckers from Alberta. By the way, the convoy actually started in Ontario. That's another story by itself. But what it did is people right across the country from Victoria to Corner Brook stood up and said, yeah, we're with them guys. We don't like what's going on. And then, of course, the whole thing kind of blew up or whatever. Nonetheless, it occurred. It fired people up. It got them thinking. It got them moving. So what's happening this summer? James Top, Warrant Officer James Top, is walking across Canada. He left British Columbia. He's on his way to Ottawa. He's going to be here at the end of June, something like that. And throughout the summer, the arrival of James Top is going to be turned into a freedom movement for the summer. So the Canadian Coalition for Freedom, which is being formed right now, will be the sort of overlords for this. V4F, Veterans for Freedom, are going to be the sort of planner, estimators, sustainers for logistics and all that sort of stuff. And a series of other Canadian groups. I won't mention them here because some are on board, some of them aren't on board yet. But a whole bunch of Canadian groups are going to advocate for about 60 to 75 days of nonstop protests in Ottawa, targeting the Ministry of Justice, Minister of the Environment, targeting the Prime Minister's office, and saying, we want Canada back. It should be a sovereign state. It should be a democratic state. And it should be a state where we have accountability. And it should be a state where the documents of the country matter. Constitution, Charter, Criminal Code. So those are the sort of four pillars of the movement, if you will.
Amazing.
But it's democracy. We want our democracy back. We want our freedom back. We want rule of law. We support government. Because they tried to say the convoy was trying to overthrow the government. It's like, no, it's not.
Smaller, accountable government.
We want accountable government. We want the charter to apply. We want the Constitution to apply. So the point of the Canadian Coalition for Freedom this summer is to turn it into a summer of love in Ottawa, get people out, get them engaged, get them working together, get them working across boundaries, geographic, ethnic, linguistic, whatever, and say, let's get Canada back on track to a sovereign, democratic, prosperous country. And,
I love it. Yes.
Anyway, so there's some hope, and right across Canada, folks are having little things. There's one in Welland this weekend, a Unity truck rally, and it's just a bunch of folks coming out to say, hey, you know what? We want accountable government again.
I love that. I talked to one of the senior people with the John Birch Society. I don't know if you know them in the US. It's a great organization. I can send you the link, but he was talking about how we need to educate people about constitutional law. And then really the whole myth of left and right. I said, the people who are, a lot of these protesters are the moderates, actually. They're not the radicals on either side. They're the moderates looking for responsible government and following our constitutional and allowing people their basic God-given rights. So he said, you have to follow the trap of the left and right. The left is really sort of hardcore communism, socialism. The right is anarchy and no government. And most of the people protesting just want a responsible government and following the Constitution. So it's very, very simple and practical. If people want to reach you, how can they follow you or reach you, Tom? Where can they access you?
For the next little while, start watching Veterans for Freedom, start watching the Canadian Coalition for Freedom. These are the things I'm going to be working on for the next little while. Okay. I have a Twitter account that sometimes I use a lot and sometimes I don't. We'll see where it goes. It's at Tom Tsec, TOMTSEC. And sometimes I get on there and I'll rant away about all kinds of stuff. So if you're interested in keeping up with what we're doing this summer, what's going on in Ottawa, etc., that would be a couple of places to watch. Veterans for Freedom, Canadian Coalition for Freedom, and at Tom Tsec, TOMTSEC.
And your book is called National Security Intelligence in an Uncertain Age.
That's a book I put out a few years ago when I was working at Nanyang Tech in Singapore. I have another book out there on Amazon called New Order of Fear, and it's a fictional intelligence spy thriller kind of book based on what could go wrong with the Great Reset and how the whole project could turn sour.
I like that.
So that's a fun one. And coming up in June, I hope to have another book out called Eyewitness to Deceit. And what it is essentially going to do is it's going to deconstruct the government's narrative against the convoy, issue by issue, page by page, to show how almost everything the government put out was a blatant lie and how they're still lying to Parliament. So the arson against the apartment building wasn't the convoy. The shotguns in the truck, there were none. The white supremacy thing, exact opposite problem. At all those sorts of issues, we had Senator Busan, who is former RCMP commissioner, say the convoy is being led by anarchists. These are highly skilled, highly intelligent people. And I just sat there and thought, dear God, you're former RCMP commissioner. You're not some, somebody from, I don't know where. Saying that it's anarchists. So what you actually, if you look at what the anarchists were saying about the convoy, the anarchists said, the Punch Up Collective said, these people are the enemy. So for her to stand up in the Senate and say the convoy is being run by anarchists was just absolute ludicrous stupidity. So anyway, the point of this book, Eyewitness to Deceit, will be to deconstruct the narrative and say, look, I was in the center of all of this. I was the G2 for the mission. I was doing protective intelligence for the whole convoy. And it's like the government's narrative was crap from the get-go. Everything they put out was a willful, deliberate lie to try and deconstruct the convoy as an actual positive thing. So anyway, that's coming out, and that may be some fun. Marco Mendocino won't like the book, but what can I do?
Well, thank you for everything you've been doing. I mean, I could listen to you for hours. You've got just such a knowledge on so many different topics, Tom. So I'm going to follow you, Adley. I will be there in Ottawa. I can't wait to be there for James Top's arrival and help this summer with our all of the different things going on. So thanks again, and I'll have to talk to you again on some of these other topics.
One last quick thought just before we go. James Top should be arriving 28th, 29th of June. If you can't afford to travel and go on a vacation anymore, like who the heck, and if you're not allowed to travel on an airplane anymore, come to Ottawa this summer. Come for James Top's arrival. Come to the protest. You'll have a lot of fun. The convoy was a hoot. The convoy is a massive street party, contrary to what was portrayed in the press. So it'll be a lot of fun.
I've never been hugged so much in my life, and never met such incredibly kind-hearted, loving people from across the country. Just generous, giving, kind. I mean, it really heartened a lot of us. So yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thanks so much, Tom. And
cheers.
Yeah.